There is a kind of man that nobody writes about in business magazines, not because he hasn't done anything worth writing about, but because he spent 40 years making sure nobody knew where to find him. I am that kind of man. My name is Howard Briggs. I am 67 years old. I live in the same two-story house on Clover Mill Road in Fenwick, Pennsylvania, that I bought in 1991 for $112,000. The gutters need cleaning. The back porch is a board that groans when you step on the left side, and I've been meaning to fix it for approximately 6 years. I drive a 2004 Ford F-150 that my son-in-law once described within my earshot as a truck that looks like it's had a hard life. He wasn't wrong, but what he didn't understand, and what I never bothered to explain, was that I could have bought the dealership. Let me back up. I started Briggs Capital Consulting in 1987 out of a spare bedroom with a fax machine and a phone that shared a line with the kitchen. My wife Eleanor, God rest her, thought I had lost my mind leaving a perfectly good position at First National. I told her I hadn't lost my mind. I had just decided to stop lending it to someone else. She gave me 18 months. I gave myself 12. We were both wrong. By 1995, Briggs Capital had 17 employees and 2 regional clients most people in this state would recognize by name. By 2004, we had grown into what I can only describe as something I no longer fully understood from the outside, which is how I knew it had become something real. We restructured. We brought in partners. We built holding layers that I will not bore you with here, except to say that by design, my name does not appear prominently in any of them. I have always believed that the loudest thing a man can do is own something and shut up about it. Briggs Capital and its subsidiaries are currently valued at approximately $1.4 billion. I drove to church last Sunday in a truck with a cracked dashboard and a stereo that only picks up AM. Nobody in that parking lot would have guessed. I would not have wanted them to. Now let me tell you about my daughter and about the man she married. My daughter Claire is 36 years old. She has Eleanor's eyes and my stubbornness, which is, I've been told, an extremely inconvenient combination. She teaches 3rd grade at Fenwick Elementary. Has for 9 years. She chose that on her own. I offered her a position through one of our education consulting subsidiaries once, very gently when she was 28. She looked at me with those eyes and said, "Dad, I actually want to do something." I laughed for about 3 minutes straight. She was right. She does something. 3 years ago, Claire married a man named Preston Webb. I want to be fair here. I genuinely do. I have tried, in the years since, to examine my impression of Preston Webb and asked myself whether I arrived at it too quickly, whether I let small things accumulate into a judgment that wasn't fully earned. I have done this examination carefully and honestly, and I keep arriving at the same place. Preston Webb is a man who has never once, in 3 years of being my son-in-law, asked me a single question about my life that wasn't in some way about him. He is 41 years old. He worked as the Senior Vice President of Operations at Clearfield Meridian Group, a mid-sized logistics and supply chain firm headquartered in Pittsburgh. He makes $310,000 a year and considers this to be a reflection of his exceptional value. He drives a leased BMW that he replaces every 2 years. He has a very firm handshake and an even firmer sense of his own importance. And he has this way of speaking in meetings, I'm told, where he uses words like leverage and synergy and scalable infrastructure in combinations that sound meaningful if you're moving fast, but dissolve entirely the moment you slow down and look directly at them. The first time I met him, he mentioned within 11 minutes that he had an MBA from Carnegie Mellon. I counted. Claire loves him. I know she loves him because I know my daughter and because Eleanor always said that Claire loves the way she teaches, completely with her whole attention, not holding anything back. I trusted that. I still trust that. But love is not the same thing as judgment, and what I watched over 3 years of Sunday dinners and holiday visits was a man who was very carefully, very methodically, building a version of my daughter's life that centered entirely on what he needed her to be. I said nothing. I am a patient man. I come from patient men. My father spent 30 years in the coal industry in Cambria County, working for people who thought nothing of him, watching, waiting, learning everything he could about a business he did not own yet. Then one day he did own it. Not the coal. He was smarter than that. But the land beneath 3 former operations that everyone else had written off. He sold it 15 years later for more than most people earn in a lifetime. He was not a man who explained himself. Neither am I. So I watched. I smiled. I showed up to Sunday dinners in my good flannel shirt and brought a bottle of decent wine and let Preston steer the conversation wherever he wanted it to go, which was always, without exception, back to Preston. Things shifted about 14 months ago. That was when Clearfield Meridian Group was quietly acquired by one of my holding companies. I want to be precise here because precision matters to me. The acquisition was not engineered to put Preston Webb in a particular position. It was a legitimate business decision that my team had been evaluating for nearly 2 years. Clearfield Meridian had solid infrastructure and a client base that aligned well with our southeastern expansion. Preston Webb happened to work there. The fact that I became, through 3 layers of corporate structure, his ultimate employer, the person at the top of the org chart above the CEO, above his division head above him, was not something I planned. It was something I noticed. And once I noticed it, I paid attention. What I observed over the following 8 months was a man who was very good at appearing essential without being essential. Preston was skilled at visibility. He presented well in meetings. He sent emails at 11:30 at night to make sure his name was in people's inboxes first thing in the morning. He built relationships laterally and used them to manage information upward. None of this is unusual. I have seen it many times. The difference is that most people who operate this way are still doing the underlying work. Preston had started, quietly, carefully, to do something else. But I am getting ahead of myself. Because before the boardroom, there was the dinner. The dinner was my son-in-law's idea. He called me on a Wednesday evening, friendly and casual, the voice of a man who has made his decision and is now performing the consultation. "Howard," he said, "Vivienne and I have been wanting to get the families together for a while now. Her parents are coming in from Scottsdale next month. We thought a dinner at Harvest and Stone, the whole family, it'd be nice." He paused. "Nice place, by the way. Upscale. You like it. Harvest and Stone is a restaurant in Pittsburgh's East End that charges $42 for a pork chop. I know this because I have been to Harvest and Stone. I know this because I was briefly an investor in the group that owns it." Preston did not know that. What Preston was actually telling me, in the warm and friendly language of a man who believes he is being subtle, was that this was not going to be a jeans and flannel kind of evening and I should plan accordingly. "I appreciate the heads up," I said. Of course," he said quickly. "Just want everyone to be comfortable. You know how these things are." I told him I would be there. Then I hung up and sat for a while at the kitchen table where Eleanor and I used to drink our morning coffee. And I thought about what kind of man calls his father-in-law to suggest he dress appropriately. I thought about what that call was really about. And I thought about the dinner that was coming and the people who were going to be in that room and what they probably wanted from it. I want you to understand something about Vivienne's parents. Franklin Ashworth is 74 years old. He spent his career as a partner at a corporate law firm in Phoenix and made a considerable amount of money doing so. He is a man who views wealth as a sorting mechanism, not a private fact but a public credential, something you display so that other people can correctly locate you in the hierarchy. His wife, Constance, is the kind of woman who compliments your home in a way that is actually a measurement. She arrived at that dinner and within 6 minutes had made 3 observations about the restaurant that were structured, technically, as appreciation but were functioning entirely as assessment. I drove to Pittsburgh in the truck, the F-150 with the cracked dashboard and the AM stereo. I pulled into the Valley Lane at Harvest and Stone and handed over the keys and watched the young man behind the stand look at the truck with the expression of a person recalibrating an expectation. I tipped him $20 before he moved the vehicle. I was wearing clean dark slacks, a pressed button-down shirt in a blue that Eleanor always said suited me, and the sport coat I keep in the back of my closet. Not the charcoal suit, not yet. Just the sport coat. Neat, appropriate, nothing that announced anything. Preston met me in the lobby. He looked at my outfit with the eyes of a man executing a rapid assessment that he believed was invisible. It was not invisible. I have been reading people in rooms for 40 years. What I saw in that half-second was relief that I had not embarrassed him, followed immediately by faint disappointment that I hadn't provided an opportunity for the Ashworths to appreciate the contrast. He recovered into a smile and clapped me on the shoulder. "Howard, glad you made it. Come on in. They're already at the table." Franklin Ashworth stood up when I approached, which I respected. He had a firm handshake and direct eyes, which I respected less once I understood what was behind them. Constance offered me a warm two-handed grip and said, "We have heard so much about you, Howard. Claire is just a treasure." She said it the way you say it about someone else's child, when what you mean is that they have married beneath themselves. But you're being gracious about it. We sat. The bread arrived. Franklin ordered wine. A bottle, specifically, which he named by vineyard and vintage, and then described briefly for the table. I nodded appreciatively. I have 4 cases of a better vintage in my basement at home. I said nothing. The evening moved the way these evenings move when everyone at the table is performing a version of themselves. Preston talked about his role at Clearfield Meridian with the measured confidence of a man reciting prepared remarks. Franklin asked targeted questions about the company's revenue and trajectory and nodded in the way that senior men nod when they are confirming something they already believe. Constance asked Claire about the school year and listened for about 40% of the answer before redirecting to whether she and Preston had thought more about the house in Fox Chapel. I watched my daughter navigate all of it with a grace that made me proud and an exhaustion around her eyes that made me pay attention. At some point during the main course, Franklin turned to me. "So, Howard," he said pleasantly, "Preston tells us you had a consulting business before you retired." "Something like that," I said. "Good for you," he said, and the way he said it, not unkind, not contemptuous, just genuinely unconcerned, told me everything I needed to know about what this dinner was actually for. Dessert came. Franklin ordered a digestive and then folded his hands on the table in the way of a man who has arrived at the part of the evening he came for. "Howard," he said, and his voice dropped into the measured register of a man who has given this speech before, or something very much like it. "We want to talk about Preston's future." Preston was sitting very straight, with the posture of a man who knows what's coming and has decided to look natural about it. "Preston has an opportunity," Franklin continued, "a real one. He's been developing a concept, operational efficiency consulting, boutique firm, the kind of specialized shop that major corporations are paying significant retainers for right now. The groundwork is done. The market is right. What he needs is capitalization." He reached inside his jacket and placed a folded document on the table, slid it toward me. "We've put together a proposal. Franklin Ashworth, myself, a small group of partners. We're prepared to fund a portion. We're asking you to consider contributing the remainder, secured against Claire's inheritance, which Preston tells us is considerable." The table went quiet. I looked at the document. I looked at Preston. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the table, which told me he had more awareness of what was happening than he wanted to display. I looked at Claire. Her hands were in her lap and she was very still, which meant she was either surprised or she had known and was waiting to see how I would respond. I picked up the document. I read it. All of it. The full page. The structure. The projected returns. The collateral arrangement. The clause, buried near the bottom, worded carefully, specifying that if the venture did not reach certain thresholds within 24 months, the collateral would be liquidated to cover the investor's initial positions. I set the document down. I picked up my coffee. Took a slow sip. "I appreciate the thought that went into this," I said warmly. "Give me some time to look it over properly." Franklin exhaled. Constance reached for her wine. Preston's shoulders came down half an inch. I finished my coffee. I thanked Constance for a lovely evening. I shook Franklin's hand. A full grip this time, steady, my eyes on his for one extra second that he registered but could not quite interpret. I retrieved my truck from the valet, tipped him again on the way out. I drove home through the dark on the interstate with the window cracked and the heater running in the AM radio picking up a weather report I wasn't listening to. I was thinking about the document. About the collateral clause. About Preston looking at the table. About Claire's hands in her lap about what a man looks like when he is borrowing his wife's future without asking her first. I let 16 days pass. I tended the yard on the weekends. I had lunch with my old friend Walt. That one name I can use, since he's not in any of this, at the diner on Route 30. I went to church. I called Claire twice, normal calls, nothing weighted. On day 5, Preston texted me. "Hey Howard, just wanted to check in. Hope you had a chance to review the proposal. Big opportunity, timing is important. Let me know if you have questions." I waited 4 hours and replied, "Still reviewing, Preston. These things take time." He sent a thumbs up. I set my phone down and made 3 phone calls. Not to Preston, not to Franklin Ashworth, to the people who run the internal compliance division of Clearfield Meridian Group, because here is what I have been sitting with for 8 months. Here is what I've been accumulating in a folder on my desk at home, a folder I have been adding to quietly and without urgency, the way you add to something you know you will eventually need. Preston Webb had been building his boutique consultancy, the one he presented to Franklin and me as a concept, a future possibility, a vision, for the better part of a year, on company time, using company resources. His laptop, his phone, his assistant's hours. He had used internal client data, proprietary operational frameworks that Clearfield Meridian had developed over a decade, and 2 existing client relationships to begin the work of constructing a competing enterprise. He had done this carefully on the assumption that nobody above his division head was paying attention. He had forgotten, because he had no way of knowing that the organization chart above his division head led, eventually, to me. The compliance review took 9 days. The findings were thorough. They were documented. They were, from a legal standpoint, unambiguous. On a Thursday morning, I put on the charcoal suit from the back of my closet, the one I wore when we closed the acquisition of a regional bank holding in 2019. I knotted the tie Eleanor gave me for our 31st anniversary. I drove the F-150 to Pittsburgh, parked it in a visitor spot in the Clearfield Meridian garage, and walked into the executive conference room on the 14th floor. The board members were already seated. Legal was to my right. The compliance report was in a folder in front of me. I had been introduced to most of these people in their capacity as board members of a company I quietly owned. Most of them had never seen me in anything but casual clothes, on the rare occasions they'd seen me at all. Preston walked in 4 minutes later. He was carrying his laptop bag over one shoulder, moving with the easy confidence of a man who has been in this room many times and considers it his natural habitat. He scanned the room. He registered the board members. He registered the legal team. He registered the documents on the table. And then his eyes moved to the head of the table and he registered me. I watched it happen. I have watched it happen before, over 40 years of moments like this one, and it never looks the same twice. What moved across Preston Webb's face in that moment was not one thing. It was a sequence. Recognition, arriving floor by floor, the way an elevator stops and opens at every level on the way down, the acquisition, the org chart, my name on documents he had walked past 100 times, 3 years of Sunday dinners, the BMW, Carnegie Mellon, Geneva. No, that was the other story, the dinner at Harvest and Stone. The document Franklin slid across the table, every single piece of the last 3 years landing in that room simultaneously. He stood in the doorway for 4 seconds. I counted. Then I said, quietly, "Have a seat, Preston." He sat. "I'm going to say this once," I said, "not because I'm angry. I want to be clear about that. I am not angry with you. Anger belongs to men who didn't see it coming, and I saw this coming a while ago." I opened the folder. Clearfield Meridian Group is owned by Harrington Structural Partners. Harrington Structural Partners is a subsidiary of Briggs Capital Holdings. Briggs Capital Holdings belongs to me. Has, in one form or another, for over 30 years. He was very still. The company where you have built your career, the salary you draw, the platform you have spent 3 years using to establish your professional reputation, that infrastructure exists and continues to exist because of decisions I made long before you walked into it. I set my hand flat on the folder. For the past 10 months, you used that infrastructure, company time, company devices, proprietary client data, to build a competing venture that you then presented. to your father-in-law and to me as a fresh concept requiring outside investment. I let that sit for a moment. Our legal team has reviewed the compliance findings in detail. Every element is documented. The clause in your employment agreement governing proprietary information and competitive activity is unambiguous and covers everything in this report. I looked at him steadily. We can pursue this through formal channels, in which case the documentation becomes part of the public record, or we can resolve this here. He looked at the board. They were neutral. He looked at legal. Neutral. He looked at legal. Neutral. He looked back at me. And here's the thing I did not expect, in the way that you never quite expected, even when you think you know how a man will react under pressure. He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He didn't negotiate. He didn't reach for the language of a man trying to manage a situation. He just looked at me with an expression I can only describe as the particular tiredness of someone who has been carrying a version of themselves that doesn't fit and has finally been given permission to put it down. "I'll resign," he said, quietly, like it cost him something to say it, but less than he thought it would. "That's the appropriate decision," I said. I stood. I buttoned my jacket. "One more thing," I said at the door, and I turned back. The proposal Franklin presented at dinner, the collateral arrangement against Claire's inheritance. I let 1 second pass. "My attorneys transferred Claire's assets yesterday morning into a personal trust in her name alone, irrevocable, requires her signature, and 2 independent trustees for any disbursement. The collateral Franklin was counting on no longer exists in the form he believed it did." I paused. "Tell him I appreciated the pork chop." I drove home. The F-150 groaned at the first start the way it always does. That low complaint it makes in cold weather, as if registering a formal objection. Before deciding to cooperate, I pulled out of the garage and merged onto the interstate and drove the 40 minutes back to Fenwick with the window cracked and the heater on and my hands easy on the wheel. I pulled into the driveway on Clover Mill Road, sat in the truck for a while, looked at the house Eleanor and I bought in 1991. The gutters that need cleaning, the porch board that still groans on the left side. I went inside and called my daughter. She came over that evening. I made dinner simple. Pasta, salad, the bread from the bakery on 3rd Street that she has liked since she was 12. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and she looked at my face the way she has looked at my face her whole life, reading it the way people read. A landscape they grew up in, knowing where all the rises and the hollows are. I told her everything. The structure of the company, the acquisition, the compliance review, what the review found, the conversation in the conference room that morning, the trust, her name, 2 independent trustees, signed and filed yesterday. Everything. I laid it out the way I would lay out a business decision for someone who deserved to understand the full picture. Because she did deserve it. She always had. When I finished, Claire was quiet for a long time. She looked out the window at the yard, at the oak tree that's been there longer than the house, at the garden where I put in the raised beds the summer after Eleanor passed. Then she looked back at me. "Dad," she said, "why didn't you ever tell me? Any of it?" I looked at my coffee cup, looked at the table, looked at my daughter, who has Eleanor's eyes and my stubbornness, and a life that she built entirely from her own choices, not from what she thought she was supposed to want. "Because I never wanted you to look at me and see a balance sheet," I said. "I wanted you to look at me and see your father, and I never wanted you to make choices about your life based on what you thought you were standing next to. I wanted you to stand on your own ground. You always did. I needed you to know that you did that, not me." She was quiet again. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over mine the way Eleanor used to. She didn't say anything for a while. She didn't have to. We ate dinner. We talked about her students. A boy named Marcus who had figured out multiplication faster than any 3rd grader she'd taught in 9 years. A girl who had started writing her own stories and leaving them on Claire's desk without her name on them, just the stories, folded in half, left like small gifts. We talked about the garden and what I was putting in come spring. We talked about the porch board I still hadn't fixed. We didn't talk about Preston. There would be time for that. That's a longer conversation, one that belongs to Claire, not to me. My job in that conversation is to listen, not to lead. What I thought about later, after she left and I was washing the dishes alone in the quiet kitchen, was Franklin Ashworth, sitting in his suite at whatever hotel they had booked in Pittsburgh, getting a phone call from his son-in-law, working through the sequence of what had happened and what it meant. Constance setting down her reading glasses, the proposal, the document, the collateral, all of it arranged around an assumption about who I was, an assumption they had made in the first 10 minutes of meeting me and never once thought to revisit. I don't hold it against them, not really. People see what they expect to see. That is not a character flaw. It is simply a habit of mind, and most people never find a reason to break it. I found the dish towel and dried my hands and looked out the kitchen window at the dark yard. 40 years. Every decision made quietly, built carefully, documented thoroughly, layered in ways that protected the people I care about and the work I believe in. An old truck in the driveway, a house with gutters that need cleaning, a porch board that groans on the left, and underneath all of it, something that has been there the whole time, solid and patient and exactly what it always was. Some things don't need to announce themselves, they just need to be there when it matters. Eleanor knew. She was the only one who always knew from the very beginning before any of it was worth knowing. She used to say, "Howard, you are the longest game I have ever seen anyone play." Then she would laugh, and I would laugh, and we would go back to our coffee. I went back to my coffee. The yard was dark. The oak tree was still. Somewhere out on Clover Mill Road, a car passed without slowing. Everything was exactly as it had always appeared to be. And nothing was. I had been thinking about cause and effect for most of my adult life, not in any formal or philosophical way, just in the practical way that a man thinks about it when he has spent 40 years watching decisions accumulate into consequences, slowly, the way sediment builds at the bottom of a river. You can't always see it happening. But it's always happening. Preston Webb made a series of choices, each one small enough on its own to seem inconsequential. He chose to use company resources to build something for himself. He chose to present it as a new idea rather than an ongoing project. He chose to sign an employment agreement without reading it carefully. He chose, at that dinner table, to sit with his shoulders back and his chin up, while his father-in-law slid a document toward a man Preston had already decided was nobody worth accounting for. Each of those choices made the next one easier. That is how it always works. A man doesn't arrive at a boardroom reckoning in a single step. He walks there, one small accommodation at a time, until he has traveled so far from where he started that he can't quite remember when the direction changed. I made choices too. I chose, 30 years ago, to build something real rather than something visible. I chose to let people assume whatever they wanted to assume about the man in the old truck with the cracked dashboard, because I had learned early that the assumptions people make about you in the first 5 minutes are the most useful information they will ever give you about themselves. I chose to be patient. I chose to wait. I chose, when it finally mattered, to be exactly prepared. What I think about most, when I think about all of it, is not Preston. It is not Franklin Ashworth with his folded document and his rehearsed voice. It is Claire, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a warm mug, asking me why I never told her. I gave her the answer I believed. But I have been sitting with a longer answer since then, one that takes more time to say. The longer answer is this. I wanted her to build a life that was genuinely hers, not because I was withholding something from her, but because I had watched enough people inherit a context and mistake it for a foundation. Wealth that arrives before a person has figured out who they are tends to answer questions that should have been left open a little longer. Claire answered her own questions. 3rd grade classroom, 9 years, kids who leave stories on her desk without their names on them. That is not something I gave her. That is something she built from her own material, her own choices, her own sense of what a life is for. I needed her to know that. She needed to know that she knew it. There is a version of this story where I intervene earlier, where I sit Preston down after the first Sunday dinner and explain the full picture, where I protect my daughter before she needs protecting. I understand why that version seems cleaner, But I have found, in 67 years, that the cleanest seeming version of a thing is rarely the truest one. People learn what they are capable of by being allowed to be capable of it. Claire handled more of this than I ever let her know I saw. She is stronger than any inheritance I could have transferred into her name. What I want anyone to take from this, if there is anything to take, is something simpler than a lesson. It is just an observation, the kind that only becomes visible from a certain distance. The choices you make when you believe no one is watching are the ones that define you most completely. Preston believed no one above him was paying attention. He was wrong, and eventually that wrongness caught up to him in a conference room on a Thursday morning. But that is not the important part. The important part is that he had been making those choices long before anyone found out. The finding out was just the moment the river became visible. The sediment had been building for years. Build carefully, build honestly, and never, for a single moment, assume that the quiet man at the end of the table has nothing to say.